Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you to the IATF Common Audit Report, or CARA, and Remote Auditing presentation. My name is Joseph Korlikowski. I am a Veto Power Review team member for PJR, and I'll be taking you through our presentation. A couple of notes for our participants today. All of you are on mute, but we absolutely want to address any questions that you may have. So we ask that you use the question portion of the dashboard. One of the more common questions that we get on our webinars is whether or not the presentation will be made available later. We do make our presentations available in two ways. First, if you want to get a copy of the slides, those will be available for download shortly after we're finished. And if you'd like to rewatch this webinar with the live voiceover, it will be posted to our YouTube page. And you can find a link for that on our website. Just look for the link previously recorded webinars. Our presentation, as I indicated, is a two-part presentation. We're going to start with CARA. We're going to discuss what it is, how it works, talk about some differences in the audit process, and how the non-conformance response process has changed. I've got some links for you, some information on some resources for learning more about CARA. We'll then shift gears and go into IATF remote audits. We'll cover some policies, talk about qualifying for an IATF remote audit, and what needs to happen if something goes wrong. From there, we'll have just a couple concluding remarks and then your questions. So let's begin with CARA. Now, CARA, as I said, which stands for Common Audit Report Application, goes back to fall of last year. It's about a year old at this point. It was issued with the intent of getting some consistency in the completion and reporting of the IATF audits. And it does cover all of the audit types that are listed in the IATF Rules 5th edition. So that includes Stage 1, Stage 2, surveillances, recerts, and special audits also, which of course are done for a variety of reasons. So in terms of understanding what CARA is, when it was initially developed, there was some speculation that it was going to possibly resemble the OASIS database that's used by the aerospace industry. Now, ultimately, that is not what was released. It's very important that you remember that CARA is not a database. When you work in the CARA system, it is a tool. It's an audit reporting tool. So every auditor, every certification body is given credentials to get into CARA, to create content, but that content resides on the user's web browser, and it cannot be shared with anybody until it is outputted into one of the possible output formats. I'll be giving you some clarification on that in a few slides here. One initial important takeaway I want you to have is do not think of CARA as a database. Whatever data you enter into the CARA tool will not magically show up on your auditor's computer until you send it to your auditor using the required steps. So obviously it's concerning to the industry. Is the audit process going to be any different under CARA? Now, when CARA was developed, the intent was to impact the audit reporting process. The audit process itself should not feel any differently. And indeed, after a year of usage, I think the collective feedback that we've gotten from our clients and from our auditors is that the actual business of doing the audit is unchanged. Now, there is one slight adjustment that you may or may not be aware of. Our auditors are now permitted to allocate up to 15% of their on-site time to report writing. Now that had been 10% previously. It's now 15 if the audit, as the audit is now being done with this CARA tool. Now, as I alluded to earlier in the presentation, the big change for our clients is going to be responding to non-conformances. The process before, for any of you that are on our call today that have been with us for a few years, you were no doubt accustomed to getting a file, most likely a Microsoft Word file, either by email or flash drive, and that file contained your non-conformances. You were then instructed to fill in your responses and send those back to the auditor with the evidence attached. Now, under CARA, the principles are the same, but the methodology has been significantly changed. So let's go over what the process is, kind of step by step. So at the end of the audit, the auditor is going to prepare the non-conformances within the CARA application. And those are going to be given to you, again, email, flash drive, etc., with the non-conformances housed in what's called a JSON file, a JSON file. Now, depending on the number of non-conformances being written, the auditor may opt to give you a single JSON file or multiple JSON files. If you've got a large team, you're going to have different groups of folks working on different non-conformances. You can request that your non-conformances be sent in individual JSON files. Now, it's important to note that the JSON file itself cannot be opened or manipulated outside of CARA. If you double click on it, you're going to get an error message. So in the picture here, just as an example, you'll get an email from the auditor saying, here are your non-conformances, and the attachment will be a JSON file that you can then use within the CARA system. From there, once you have your JSON file, you need to go to the designated CARA website for the IATF clients, and that is nc-cara.iatfglobaloversight.org. Once you're there, you'll click on the Load Report or Backup button in the bottom row, and I've got it pictured for you here, and you will load the JSON file that your auditor provided you. Now, once the JSON has been loaded, you'll then be able to respond to the non-conformances by clicking on the edit icon. I've got it highlighted here. It kind of looks like a pencil. It's going to be on the right-hand side when you're reviewing the list. So if you click that edit icon, you'll be able to get into the non-conformance and prepare your response. Now, once you've clicked that edit button, you'll be able to review the auditor's non-conformance, which of course is the three-part statement: statement of non-conformity, evidence of non-conformity, and requirement. Now, obviously, the auditor will, at the closing meeting, go over the non-conformances with you, but it's a very good idea to do a careful review right away when you get that JSON file. You want to make sure that what the auditor has written is it's factually accurate, that there's nothing being misconstrued, etc. If there is something that needs to be clarified, what have you, you need to notify your auditor as soon as possible. And I'll hasten to add, if you are intending on filing a dispute, if you've explained everything to the auditor and there is still a disconnect on whether or not the non-conformance is legitimate, we do have a process for a dispute filing, but you have to do so within 15 calendar days from the end of the audit. So bear that in mind. Now, assuming that the non-conformances are understood, agreed to, you would then begin the process of responding. and going through all of the various response fields. So let me walk you through these. The first one that you're going to hit is called Correction Containment. Now this one is essentially, what have you done to address the immediate issue that was raised by the auditor? This should include the results of your extent analysis to make sure that all similar situations were addressed. There is an evidence of implementation box right after correction containment. Now what this is for is for you to explain what evidence you've provided that relates to the correction. There's also an evidence of implementation field for corrective action too. Now, please note this is not the actual evidence items themselves. You're not dragging attachments into this box. This is a description. The idea here is that you want to expedite the auditor's ease of review of these items. Now, we're going to highlight where the actual evidence items can be attached in just a few minutes here. So again, your correction, containment, explain what you did to address the immediate issue, explain what evidence you're providing, and then the actual evidence attachments come just a little bit later. Now there's actually 4 separate boxes pertaining to root cause, the root cause process. Beginning with root cause analysis, and this is actually a somewhat newer item in spite of the name. This is the, as the name would imply, the analysis of the cause. So if you have a 5 set of steps that you go through, if you have an investigation that you completed, this root cause analysis is where all of that should be captured. There's also a root cause analysis files item. It's optional if you want to upload your fishbone diagram or whatnot where your root cause steps are shown. Now the most important of these 4 items is the root cause result. This is your final established cause for the cited issue. So whatever cause or causes you've arrived at, this is where you will ultimately make those official. And then there is a root cause results files item as well. Again, optional. You may or may not have an attachment to support your root cause result. Now from there, obviously, we go into the corrective action portion of the response. Systemic corrective actions, this is where you're going to outline what your corrective actions are. Again, this needs to include timing and responsible parties. There is a field called Systemic Corrective Actions Files. This is actually a duplicate field and can be disregarded. In terms of files, on the next slide, I'll highlight for you where that can go. We have evidence of implementation is next. Now this applies specifically to the corrective action portion of your response, and this should be used similarly to what we were looking at earlier for correction. Describe the evidence that's being provided and correlate it back to your corrective action statement. And then we have the evidence of implementation files. Now, this is where you should kind of pool all of your evidence items, all of the items that you did for the correction, for the corrective actions. They need to go here, or they should go here. Now, unfortunately, the only file types that are supported by CARA are JPEG and PDF files. So if you have additional evidence pieces, if you have things in Word format, Excel format, etc., we'll definitely still take those, but you can't upload them to CARA. If you have evidence that's rooted in other file types, these will need to be emailed separately to your auditor. Now, please note, those items should still be referenced in the evidence of implementation field. You still need to describe for us what evidence you're giving, even if it is not uploaded directly to CARA. Now, the final fields that you are to provide content for relate to verification of effective implementation. Now, obviously, this should include verification of correction and corrective actions and any related evidence that you can provide to support your verification activities. Now, once you've inputted all of the required information, there's going to be a button at the bottom of the page called Save NCs for Auditor. You're going to click that button and it's going to output a brand new JSON file that you can then email to your auditor. We also highly recommend that you use the print report feature to output a PDF record for your own records. Now, a word of caution. Make sure that you're looking for the mandatory fields as you are filling in your response. These are fields that have to have content provided in order for the report to be complete. And the best way for you to do this is to look for the red outlined boxes. I've given you an example here below. Look for those, fill in all of those items, and that's how you will know that all of the required content is being provided. Now, as your auditor reviews your items, hopefully, they'll be able to approve all of those items on first pass. But if they happen to have some issues, or if it gets to someone like myself at the veto review phase and we find issues, there are boxes within CARA for us to outline our concerns. And here's an example of how these concerns would be sent back to you, again, with an updated JSON file. And you would then go back and update whatever areas were found not acceptable, provide new evidence, and so forth. Now, after the final approval has been granted, you should expect to receive a finalized file showing the approval for your records. Now, one of the questions that's come up from time to time in the past year is clients are asking, well, can we still use our own format for recording responses? This was allowed in the past. Unfortunately, this will not be permitted under the CARA system. It is mandatory that the responses be prepared within CARA. Now, you can still use your own internal process for developing your responses for your team meetings and so forth, but what you send to us, what you send to your auditor for official approval, it has to be done via the CARA application. Now, there are some resources if you want to learn a little bit more here. The IATF has developed a wiki page with some FAQs and some videos, some helpful information. I've provided the link for it here. We've also developed a couple of quick training videos that walk you through the basic steps of interfacing with CARA. The URLs are below here. I'll leave this slide up for just a couple extra seconds here if you want to do a screenshot or whatnot. Again, these slides will be made available to you after we're finished. But again, we do have some other resources out there that you can use to learn a little bit more about CARA. Let's shift gears now and go into remote auditing for IATF. Now, the policies of the IATF as it relates to remote auditing, they have, throughout the pandemic, they've outlined their policies in a document called the IATF Global Waivers and Measures in Response to the Coronavirus Pandemic. Now, that document It is public domain. If you go to the IATF website at iatfglobaloversight.org, you can download your own copy of it. I will be referring to this document extensively for the rest of the presentation as the IATF COVID memo. And for what it's worth, that memo is now in revision 6. So if you've downloaded it in the past, you're going to want to make sure that you've got revision 6 of it. Now at this point, it's kind of almost moot, but just looking back historically, when the pandemic was first declared in early 2020, there were certain industries that were reluctant to embrace remote auditing. And the automotive industry, the record will show they were the most stubborn of the holdouts. They thought that remote auditing techniques would not be effective. They were convinced, I suspect, that the pandemic was going to end a lot sooner than it has played out. What essentially ended up happening was there was great pressure applied, and finally, about a year ago, they relented and said, okay, we will accept remote audits. Now, obviously, the question then becomes, well, can any IATF client qualify for a remote audit? Well, per the COVID memo, anybody can qualify, but the only justification for an audit going remote is if it is demonstrably evident that a regular on-site audit will not be possible for reasons directly linked to the pandemic. So if you are in an area where there's been a government mandated lockdown, if you have a no visitors policy, if your auditor suddenly tests positive for COVID, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all of these are considered sufficient justification. Now, if you want to request a remote audit, the first step that you need to do is reach out to your scheduler and explain your reasoning, and you'll be sent a form titled the F108 ICT-IATF Remote Audit Questionnaire. Now, this form has been put together in a very deliberate fashion. The COVID memo from the IATF has a number of content requirements. This comes from section 1.2, where it says there needs to be a documented agreement between PJR and our client with regards to the remote audit. So let's explore the content of the F108 ICT-IATF a bit more over the next few slides, this form that you're asked to fill out. So questions 1A, B, C, and 4 relate to software and hardware. And obviously this is okay. So how is the remote audit going to be facilitated? In terms of software, we have numerous licenses for GoToMeeting. So we offer GoToMeeting to any client who needs a remote audit. Now, any of you that are not comfortable with GoToMeeting, or you've got your own software, you know, if you're using Microsoft Teams or Google Meet or whatnot, absolutely you'll be permitted to use those formats, but if you choose to use those alternatives, you are then wholly responsible for ensuring successful utilization. In terms of hardware, bear in mind it needs to be sufficiently broad that it will encompass both the administrative areas as well as the production areas. So conference room setup, absolutely, to cover admin areas, but also, you know, things like cell phones, body cameras, etc. The COVID memo says that production areas still need to be audited, and they still need to be audited across all shifts. That has not changed as a result of the remote auditing option becoming available. So there needs to be sufficient Wi-Fi or cell signal strength, what have you, to permit real-time auditor review of production areas. This can't be done with pictures or just a telephone call. This needs to be auditor eyes in the production area. Question 2 asks about your ability to support a remote audit, particularly that of your records. Are they in an electronic state? We do have certain flexibility in that clients can scan records upon request, but we do not want a situation where you're pre-selecting the evidence items. This still needs to be at auditor request. Question 3 asks if you're going to be actively manufacturing during the audit. It's mandatory, as I said, the production needs to be included. So if you have a shutdown of production, that's going to require some additional discussion. That's going to potentially impact your certification. Now, questions 5 through 10 all relate to getting critical information so that we can make sure that the audit time that we have assigned is going to be sufficient. So what are we asking in these areas here? Well, 5 through 7, those questions address where an organization has experienced a shutdown. So if you were shut down, for how long? What kind of startup plans did you have for when you came off of shutdown and so forth? Our auditors are going to potentially need to follow up on those items and any possible impact on your customers. Question 8 asks about extraordinary measures. Did you have to outsource manufacturing? Did you have to bring in temporary labor and so forth? Question 9 talks about resources that you've lost, whether temporarily or permanently. Question 10 asks about any changes that you've made to your day-to-day protocols, safety changes and so forth. Question 11 asks you to nominate what's called an Audit Coordinator. Now, this is a specific designation that's talked about in the COVID memo. And it essentially says this person is responsible for connections, auditee availability, and management of technical issues. It goes on to say you may have to have more than one coordinator, especially if there is more than one CB auditor with parallel audits being conducted simultaneously. Now, the COVID memo goes on to say that the CB shall ensure that the audit team maintains full control of the audit and discussion to ensure that the coordinator is not responding for the auditees. So this audit coordinator can be whomever is ordinarily responsible for being the auditor's guide during the on-site audit, and therefore is subject to the same bylaws for guides, those found in both the IATF rules and the ISO 17021-1 standard. Question 12 talks about what's referred to as a technology test session. And obviously, this is yet another item that is mandatory under the COVID memo. And it says that the technology test session must be performed between the client and the audit team prior to the audit for all technology types to be used. So in other words, if you have a conference room and a body camera, they both need to be included. And this needs to include all areas of the manufacturing floor as applicable. Technology test session must include a short mock audit session for each environment to test the operation and effectiveness of the remote audit. Now, you'll note that the memo specifies the test session is done between the client and the audit team, not the client and PJR. So this is something that we are adding time for in terms of making sure that the auditors are doing this in advance of the audit. This needs to be days in advance, not hours in advance. The last portion of the F108 ICT IATF asks you to provide a listing of your automotive customers and let us know if they're operational or not. And again, this goes to audit planning. Now, there's two specific things that we've just talked about that I want to spend a few extra minutes on. Let's begin with the Audit Coordinator. Again, bear in mind this person needs to be reasonably versed in the technical aspects of the remote interface. They need to know what they're doing with GoToMeeting or Microsoft Teams. They need to know what they're doing with the body camera or the cell phone. But they can't interject themselves into the audit interviews or attempt to select audit samples on the auditor's behalf. The auditor maintains control of the audit at all times. And I also want to just emphasize on this technology test session, this needs to include all areas associated with the audits, all support locations, all production areas, all administrative areas, all technology types, testing of backups. There needs to be reasonable assurance that the remote audit will be successful. And again, this technology test session needs to occur outside of the actual audit process, days before in most cases. So if you have, for example, a production building and 3 warehouses, we need to conduct a technology test session at all 4 of those locations. If all 4 of them are to be included in the audit process. Has to happen. That's required by the COVID memo. So what happens if we do our test, but unfortunately some part of the remote audit goes off the rails? Well, the COVID memo states that if any part of the remote audit cannot be completed, it has to be added to a subsequent audit, whatever time's been lost. So if the audit that you're doing remotely happens to be a surveillance audit, we're going to add whatever time was lost to your next audit. Now, if it happens to be a stage 2 or a recertification audit, in all likelihood, we're going to be doing a supplemental assessment to make up the difference in lost audit time. Unfortunately, that's going to mean additional overall time, but this is what we are required to do. Now, if your feeling is that you're not comfortable doing a remote audit or you simply cannot support it, you've got hard copy records, etc. The prior versions of the COVID memo did have certain provisions for delaying an audit in excess of the permitted timeframes from Rules 5th, Clause 511, but those extensions are no longer available. The attitude that the IATF is taking now is we've set this up so that you can do your audit on site or you can do it virtually, and therefore you have to do it on time. Now, if you have hard copy records, you may need to think in terms of transitioning at least some of those records to a virtual medium as part of the preparation for the audit. Now, to assure you, we are a tenured provider of remote audits. We've been doing remote audits since early March 2020. We've done well in excess of 1,000 of them. And I do have a separate webinar just on virtual audits. So if you want to check out that webinar, it's called Virtual Audits, Explaining PGR's Approach and Expectations. I'd like to invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars. I have a presentation on the interaction of processes and its importance to a successful audit. This is an exploration of the crucial topic of processes and how to understand them. I've already mentioned my virtual audits webinar. PJR has webinars on a variety of other topics: Stage 1 auditing, ISO 9001, ISO 14001, and so forth. If you'd like to be kept informed of the latest news automatically, the best way for you to do that is to visit our website at www.pgr.com. Go to the bottom of the page, enter your email address in the provided space, and click subscribe. You will be opted in for updates automatically. This is going to include upcoming webinars, changes in the standards, and other points of interest. I do thank you for your time. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and unlock the question portion of the dashboard if anybody has any questions today. Okay, well then I'll wish all of you a great day. Thank you very much.